The previous presentation focused upon the mental networks that form habits, determine personal identity, guide culture, and govern the childish mind. If you are unclear about mental networks or the distinction between teacher mental networks, TMNs, and mercy mental networks, MMNs, then please watch the previous presentation. This presentation will look at the interaction between facts and feelings. Our focus will be upon belief, what the mind thinks is true or false, and how the mind comes to this conclusion. We will begin with 3 examples involving belief and emotions. Math uses facts and symbols. For some people, the stress of taking a math test or attempting to decipher mathematical equations leads to emotional anxiety and a blank mind. In simple terms, the feelings cause a person to forget the facts. This response is officially known as math anxiety, and a number of academic papers have been written about this response. It is interesting that math anxiety is most prevalent in the English-speaking world, suggesting that the MMNs of English culture are causing people to regard math as a topic that is difficult to master. The typical religious revival meeting also involves an interaction between facts and feelings, but here the relationship between the two is precisely the opposite. In math anxiety, strong feelings cause a person to forget the facts. In contrast, a revival meeting uses strong emotions to encourage belief in facts. This suggests that the mind uses 2 different mechanisms to remember facts. One method that can be overwhelmed by emotions, and another method that is based in emotions. Temptation illustrates the interaction between facts and feelings. Suppose that one is faced with a choice between a delicious cake and a fresh salad. One knows that the salad is healthier than the cake. That is a simple fact. However, when one is faced with a choice, then this fact is often clouded by the emotions. The facts themselves do not change, but one's belief in the facts can be overwhelmed by the emotions of the moment. What is happening? This presentation will attempt to answer that question. We will start with a simple definition of truth, which we will then build upon in this presentation. I suggest that truth can be defined as a set of repeated connections. Using an analogy, determining truth is like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. Truth defines the shapes of the pieces, and truth determines also how these pieces fit together. When one assembles the pieces of a puzzle, they repeatedly fit together in the same way, regardless of when or where one assembles this puzzle. Similarly, truth describes connections that remain the same and do not change. The most obvious connections are spatial connections. For instance, one can see here the various parts of a bicycle. When these parts are assembled in a certain manner, then this set of connections defines a bicycle. Truth can also involve connections that occur over time. For instance, if one falls off a cliff, then this will be followed by landing at the bottom of the cliff. The connection between falling off a cliff and landing at the bottom is a repeatable connection that occurs reliably and consistently. Spatial connections are the most obvious because one can see the various pieces being connected together. However, as a Lego model illustrates, objects can be disassembled and reassembled. Therefore, even though spatial connections appear to be solid, they can and do change. Temporal connections are not as obvious because the items that are connected are separated by time. However, science has learned that these connections of cause and effect are actually more solid and more repeatable than spatial connections involving physical objects. For instance, The picture illustrates the famous experiment carried out by Galileo, in which he dropped a large ball and a small ball from the top of the Tower of Pisa and discovered that they both hit the ground at the same time. In other words, even though these two balls look different, the connection between falling off a cliff and landing at the bottom is identical. Science describes these repeated connections of cause and effect as natural processes. For those who are familiar with philosophy, I should mention that I am not defining truth as a conclusion that one can reach with certainty by following rules of rigorous logic. This type of rigorous thinking begins with some set of assumptions and then uses logic to come up with conclusions based upon these assumptions. Instead, we are looking here at the type of thinking that functions before rigorous logic, which creates the mental framework within which rigorous thought can function. When thinking at this more fundamental level, then one is never completely certain. Instead, confidence in truth grows gradually as one notices connections being repeated. For instance, a person seeing a bicycle for the first time will probably find it difficult to come to any solid conclusions about this newfangled object. In contrast, someone who lives in Amsterdam with its sea of bicycles knows with great certainty precisely what a bicycle is. Rigorous logic will not be discussed in this presentation. For those who want to pursue the topic further, the mental processing behind rigorous logic is analyzed in detail in the book Natural Cognitive Theology. The first presentation distinguished between absolute truth and universal truth. We will now take a closer look at absolute truth. I suggest that all absolute truth is based in some source of truth that is represented within the mind as a mental network. In other words, when I believe in absolute truth, then the facts themselves are secondary. Instead, what matters is the emotional strength of the mental network within my mind that represents the source of this truth. If truth is like a letter received in the mail, then absolute truth looks at the name on the envelope without opening the letter to read what is inside. However, even though absolute truth is based in emotions, it is not an emotion. Instead, it is a sense of certainty that comes when the source of truth has sufficient emotional power. The source of absolute truth is usually a person with great emotional status, as illustrated by this portrait of Napoleon. A statement made by Napoleon or by some other absolute monarch was accepted as absolute truth by the average person of his time, while the same statement made by some other individual who lacked this emotional status was not accepted as truth. That is what happens when one focuses upon the name on the envelope without opening the letter to examine what is written inside. An MMN of trauma or ecstasy can also become a source of absolute truth. For instance, a close encounter with a snake can become a defining experience that defines absolute truth. In this case, the source of truth is not some person with emotional status, but rather a set of emotional experiences that have turned into a mental network. Similarly, it is possible to find certainty in the strong emotions of some ecstatic religious or physical experience. Religious fundamentalism bases its absolute truth in the words of a holy book, and the words of this book are believed to be true because the source of this book is mentally represented as an MMN with great emotional power. Thus, a mental network that acts as a source of absolute truth may represent a real person, an emotional experience, or an imaginary person. In all cases, I suggest that the mental mechanism is the same. Absolute truth takes some specific fact and treats it as universal. For instance, suppose that I have a traumatic encounter with a vicious dog. This vivid experience will form a mercy mental network, which will become a source of absolute truth, and I will then believe with great certainty that all dogs always bite. A subsequent encounter with a friendly dog will be treated as false, because it contradicts my absolute belief. Similarly, if some important real or imaginary person makes some statement, then any contradictory statements made by other individuals will be rejected as false. Absolute truth requires a source of truth with sufficient emotional power. Saying this more precisely, the mental network that represents the source of truth within my mind must have an emotional status that is significantly greater than the emotional status associated with the mental networks that represent personal identity. Therefore, one can reinforce absolute truth by increasing the emotional intensity of the mental network representing the source of truth. One sees this illustrated by the altar call, which adds emotional intensity to the mental network that represents God. An altar call is especially effective if a person behaves in a manner that indicates that the mental networks of personal identity are subservient to the mental network that represents God, as shown by the individuals bowing physically before the altar at the front of the church. Mental networks of culture can also be used to reinforce absolute truth, as illustrated by the cartoon of Christian believers gathering together on Sunday morning to shout down their doubts. By the same token, belief in absolute truth will fade if the emotional status given to the source of truth is insufficiently strong compared to the emotional status of personal identity. This can happen if one loses respect for the source of truth, if personal identity grows in emotional status, or if one experiences too much personal pleasure. For instance, fading belief in absolute truth can be seen physically in Thomas Jefferson's Bible, shown here, because he literally used scissors to cut out all of the passages that referred to miraculous events. The person observing from the outside usually notices only the emotional status being given to the source of truth, the emotional status not being given to personal identity, and the abasement of personal identity before the emotional source of truth. However, for the individual who believes in absolute truth, the behavior goes beyond feeling to knowing, because the believer in absolute truth is using worship as a means of preserving belief. Today's postmodern society both stigmatizes and universalizes the concept of absolute truth. On the one hand, any truth that is preached by some respected source is deconstructed and called into question. Who are they to tell us what to believe? On the other hand, postmodern thought believes that there is no such thing as truth, and that anything that poses as truth is merely belief being imposed upon people's minds by some source of authority. Thus, even though postmodern thought questions absolute truth, it has no alternative to absolute truth and can only replace one source of absolute truth with another. I suggest that all knowledge, both religious and secular, begins with absolute truth. The children in Sunday school believe the priest or pastor because of his emotional status as a priest. Similarly, primary students in a school believe the teacher because of her status as a teacher. This is inevitable because absolute truth is based in mercy mental networks, and the childish mind is governed by mercy mental networks. If children do not swallow truth blindly from some officially recognized source of absolute truth, then they will swallow it blindly from some unofficial source. We saw in the previous presentation that it is much easier to recognize another person's core mental networks than it is to recognize my own. Similarly, when people from my culture use emotional status to program childish minds with absolute truth, then this will be seen as both natural and expected. In contrast, when people from another culture or religion use emotional status to teach absolute truth, then this will be condemned as taking advantage of childish vulnerability. I suggest that absolute truth will naturally be accompanied by three fundamental beliefs, which I refer to as the religious attitude. These three beliefs are a natural byproduct of regarding the mercy mental network that represents the source of truth as significantly more important than the mercy mental networks that represent personal identity. I suggest that these three beliefs will be regarded as a fundamental aspect of absolute truth, even if the content of absolute truth explicitly states that one should not follow these three beliefs. One can see this attitude illustrated by the typical picture of the throne of heaven. Notice in this illustration how God and the words of God are being portrayed as massively more potent than personal identity, and how the absolute truth of God is being reinforced by the surrounding crowd of angels. The first belief that accompanies absolute truth is self-denial. I will believe that following God means denying myself. In the extreme, this leads to what is known as worm theology, which teaches that I am a mere worm compared to the majesty of God. For instance, notice in the illustration the insignificance of the human bowing before the throne of God. The second belief that accompanies absolute truth is fervor. I will believe that following God means focusing completely on words and experiences associated with God. For instance, we can see in the illustration that the entire focus of attention is upon the throne of God. The third belief that accompanies absolute truth is transcendence, which asserts that finite humans are incapable of coming to any definite conclusions regarding the nature of God. This is illustrated by the brightness emanating from the throne of God, which makes it impossible to see exactly who or what is sitting upon the throne. This picture portrays God as vastly more important than personal identity. However, notice that God is still being represented as a finite mercy mental network rather than as a universal teacher mental network. In other words, what one sees portrayed here is a tribal concept of God that views God as the ultimate superman, and not the concept of a universal God who is beyond space and time. Thus, even though the religious attitude appears to be giving God the ultimate level of personal honor, it is actually incapable of giving God sufficient honor because it is using the wrong kind of mental network to represent God. In philosophy, this is known as a category mistake. Now that we have defined the religious attitude, let us look at the effect that it has upon religious thought and behavior. I have suggested that the religious attitude will become regarded as fundamental doctrine regardless of what a holy book actually says. One sees this illustrated by church history, which is pervaded by the three beliefs of self-denial, fervor, and transcendence. For instance, Simon Stylites was a 5th century Christian monk who spent 30 years living on top of a 50-foot tower on a platform that measured 1 square meter. The historian Edward Gibbon describes Simon's extreme level of self-denial. Quote, "His most familiar practice was that of bending his meager skeleton from the forehead to the feet, and a curious spectator, after numbering 1,244 repetitions, at length desisted from the endless account." End quote. The fervor is illustrated in the drawing by Simon's intense focus upon the heavenly cloud of angels. while the transcendence is illustrated by Simon's attempt to literally transcend human existence by living on top of a tall tower. One can see similar levels of fervor in many of the church saints. Full-time service is a less extreme version of the religious attitude. However, it shares the same three fundamental beliefs, because the religious believer who pursues full-time service believes that following God means denying self in order to focus full-time upon serving God. And the individual who is in full-time service typically believes that the ways of God transcend normal human rules of common sense. In some branches of Christianity, the religious attitude has become an overarching set of principles that define all of human existence. For instance, one sees this in the Amish way of life, as shown here in the picture of a typical Amish school. The attitude of self-denial is shown by the simplicity of the clothing and the surroundings, and the Amish go to great lengths to avoid any form of self-assertion that would be regarded as pride. Fervor can be seen in the way that all of normal existence is governed by religious principles. For example, even the little girls wear a head covering in accordance with Paul's instructions in 1 Corinthians 11. Finally, the attitude of transcendence is illustrated by the Amish approach to education, which stops at grade 10 and feels that it is both unnecessary and unwise for Christians to pursue higher education. Turning to another branch of Christianity, the Westminster Shorter Catechism begins by stating that man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. This statement can be interpreted in a manner that does not involve the religious attitude. However, it is generally used to reinforce the idea that man should ignore himself and focus upon God, and that all doctrine about God should be viewed through this lens. I have looked carefully at the biblical passages that are traditionally used to support the religious attitude and have come to the conclusion that it is not biblical. In each case, when one examines the context and the original Greek text, one notices that what is being described is more than merely a simple statement of self-denial, fervor, or transcendence. In contrast, if one examines the writings of the Church Fathers, one often finds a message that very clearly is one of self-denial, fervor, and transcendence. Self-denial is a common component of most religious behavior. For instance, the picture illustrates the Shiite Muslim festival of Ashura, in which Muslim believers flagellate themselves and Muslim mothers cut their children on the forehead. Paul talks about religious self-denial in 1 Timothy 4, referring to it as a doctrine of demons. Quote, "But the Spirit explicitly says that in later times some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons, by means of the hypocrisy of liars, seared in their own conscience as with a branding iron, men who forbid marriage and advocate abstaining from foods which God has created to be gratefully shared in by those who believe and know the truth." End quote. Looking at another example from before the time of Christ, some religions used to practice self-denial by burning their children as a sacrifice to God. The prophet Jeremiah refers to this practice as something that is so appalling that it does not even enter the mind of God. Quote, "They have forsaken me and have made this an alien place and have burned sacrifices in it to other gods that neither they nor their forefathers nor the kings of Judah had ever known. And because they have filled this place with the blood of the innocent, and have built the high places of Baal to burn their sons in the fire as burnt offerings to Baal, a thing which I never commanded or spoke of, nor did it ever enter my mind." End quote. Moving on, the Jewish attitude of fervor believed that God would never allow the holy temple in Jerusalem to be destroyed. And yet, As we saw in the first presentation, the temple to God in Jerusalem was destroyed twice. Jesus' response to fervor can be seen in Mark 13. Quote, "As Jesus was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, 'Teacher, behold what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings.' And Jesus said to him, 'Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another which will not be torn down.'" End quote. However, present-day Israel is filled with shrines and churches constructed by religious believers who were driven by fervor to focus more fully upon the events of the life of Jesus, demonstrating the emotional potency of the religious attitude. The passage that is traditionally used to illustrate the religious attitude is Revelation 4, which portrays endless worship before the throne of God, similar to the picture shown on the previous slide. However, what one finds portrayed at the end of the book of Revelation is not ceaseless worship, but rather a holy city descending from heaven onto earth, and the passage explicitly states that this city contains no religious temples. Instead of self-denial, a city is filled with homes for people. Instead of fervor, a city is characterized by daily existence. And instead of the transcendence of a shapeless being that radiates brilliance from a celestial throne, the holy city itself is described as a light to the surrounding nations. This contrast between the endless worship at the beginning of the book of Revelation and the holy city at the end of the book of Revelation implies that people are learning to interact with God in a manner that goes beyond the religious attitude. One of the primary problems with the religious attitude is that childish mercy mental networks remain the reference point. Instead of viewing evil as a distortion of good, good is typically seen as the opposite of evil, which means that one is still thinking in terms of evil. One sees this illustrated by the quote from the Desert Fathers, in which one is told to be solitary, be silent, and be at peace, implying that one finds God by leaving people and by abandoning human structure and content. Thus, the kingdom of God becomes an unkingdom that lacks the content of human existence, and the character of God is defined in a negative manner by the words that one cannot use to describe God. Similarly, the person who is slain in the Spirit believes that he has encountered God because his mind has been blasted away from the mental networks of identity, culture, and human structure. He believes that he is experiencing God because he is having an experience in which he does not think of normal human existence. The religious attitude used to be a defining characteristic of Western mentality. One sees this illustrated by monks such as Simon Stylites, and one can see this portrayed in most of the diaries and writings of those who attempted to follow God in full-time service. However, for the average person today, all that remains is the appearance of a religious attitude. For instance, instead of viewing the Westminster Catechism as a guiding principle for life, it is now typically reduced to the status of a t-shirt logo available on some website, with a t-shirt probably made in China by factory owners who believe more strongly in exploiting third world factory workers than in denying self. Similarly, religious fervor is now usually reduced to an episode of Christian praise and worship in which one sings exciting songs that talk about focusing upon God and denying self. However, one can tell that childish mercy mental networks are still in charge because this praise and worship generally uses a musical style that appeals to childish mentality. Looking at the big picture, one concludes that if human history is being guided by a real God, then God is directing society along a path that leads away from the religious attitude, similar to the transformation that one sees portrayed in the book of Revelation. Saying this more generally, I suggest that the religious attitude is a valid starting point. It can begin a person or society upon the path of personal transformation, but it cannot complete the journey. Looking first at self-denial, childish mental networks do need transforming. We expect children to have temper tantrums, but when adults respond in such a childish manner, then this leads to wars in which many people suffer and die. Self-denial recognizes that childish behavior needs to be fundamentally changed. The problem with self-denial is that it tends to suppress childish mercy mental networks rather than transform them. It is possible to suppress undesired mental networks fairly successfully by ensuring that they are not triggered. For instance, one can prevent lustful thoughts about women from being triggered by forcing women to be covered from head to toe in shapeless garments. But suppressed mental networks remain present under the surface, waiting to emerge when triggered by the environment. Thus, covering the bodies of women does not transform lustful thoughts, but merely prevents them from being triggered. This is backed up by data released by Google, which found that 6 of the top 8 porn-searching countries are Muslim states. Going further, it is very important for human behavior to be motivated by higher goals. Fervor meets this need by focusing upon God and heaven. The problem is that fervor regards heaven and God as completely separate from normal human existence, as illustrated by the picture of the gates of heaven on a cloud up in the sky. As the theologian N.T. Wright forcefully states, the focus of the Bible is not upon life after death, but rather upon life after death, in which heaven descends back down to earth in the form of a holy city. Transcendence recognizes that the childish mind is incapable of discovering fundamental truth by itself without outside help. This is an important principle that is illustrated by schools, in which adults from one generation reveal truth to children of the next generation. The problem with a religious doctrine of transcendence is that it is ultimately unteachable. If the big God is unfathomable, as the picture states, what is the point of even trying to learn about God? Unfortunately, believing that God is unfathomable has turned over the centuries into esoteric theology that is now described using complicated language backed up by erudite quotes from esteemed religious sources. But using complicated language to say that God is unfathomable can actually be worse than knowing nothing about God, because it turns ignorance into the illusion of understanding. The Bible does talk about mystery and revelation, but instead of viewing God as wrapped eternally in divine incomprehensibility, God is viewed as the revealer of mysteries who helps finite humans to increase their understanding of the nature of the universe and God. For instance, Moses did not merely have a transcendental experience of God. Instead, he was given general principles in the form of the 10 Commandments, as well as many additional, more specific laws. As we saw in the first presentation, it appears that the universe has been constructed in such a manner that it is possible to gain a reasonably good understanding by focusing upon basic principles. And one can increase this understanding by adding details to this general understanding. Summarizing, a religious attitude of transcendence is like the school student who says, "I cannot understand, do not teach me." In contrast, I suggest that being a finite, fallible human should lead to the attitude of the school student who says, "I do not understand, please teach me." We begin this presentation by observing that facts and feelings can interact in one of two ways. Feelings can determine belief, leading to absolute truth and the religious attitude. Feelings can also undermine belief, as illustrated by math anxiety and temptations. We will now examine how belief can grow in the presence of emotions. A child often gives the impression of having great belief because of the implicit trust being placed in parents and other authority figures. For instance, a child may yell, "Daddy, catch me," before leaping into the air, knowing that he will land safely in the arms of Father. This illustrates the blind faith of absolute truth. Parents are finite individuals with mental and physical limitations, but within the mind of the child, the mental networks that represent parents are emotionally all-powerful. Childish trust is followed eventually by teenage confusion. We saw that absolute truth will only remain free of doubt if the mental network that represents the source of truth is sufficiently more powerful than the mental networks that represent personal identity. Generally speaking, a teenager doubts parents not because parents have lost their emotional status, but rather because the teenager has gained emotional status. Instead of being merely a small, weak child, the teenager is both physically and mentally becoming an adult. This growing emotional importance of personal identity causes the teenager to doubt all absolute truth, including truth taught by parents. We saw a similar emotional transition at a societal level in the presentation. It was easy for medieval society to believe in the absolute truth of the Bible when every European city was dominated by the spires of a cathedral and when human efforts were minuscule compared to the acts of nature. However, when skyscrapers start to overshadow cathedrals and when human technology spans the globe, then this growth in human status will naturally cause society to question all absolute truth, including the absolute truth of the Bible. Adult knowledge is like seeing through a glass dimly. It lacks the absolute certainty of the child, but it also goes beyond the confusion of the teenager. I have suggested that it is possible for finite humans to gain an understanding of essential characteristics. This type of partial understanding leads to the sort of blurred image that emerges when looking through a cloudy pane of glass. One cannot see all of the details, but one can gain a general picture. Rigorous logic often concludes that the only alternative to knowing with total certainty is not knowing at all. However, if one is standing on the road and one sees a car coming, then one does not have to see the car with total clarity to conclude that one should step off the road in order to avoid getting hit. Seeing dimly is sufficient, and if one needs to see with greater clarity, then it is usually possible to zoom in on the details. Absolute truth can be acquired instantly. For instance, it only takes one experience with a nasty dog to know with certainty that all dogs always bite. Adult knowledge, in contrast, is acquired gradually over time. There are two reasons for this. First, as we saw earlier, repetition builds confidence. The more that I notice a set of connections being repeated, the more confidence I have in that fact. Second, facts gain in confidence as they survive emotional pressure. One could compare this to a weightlifting program. Holding on to facts in the absence of emotional pressure is like lifting weights that are very light. In contrast, attempting to hold on to facts in the presence of excess emotional pressure is like trying to lift weights that are too heavy. Mentally speaking, the result will be either confusion or else the blind certainty of absolute truth. Saying this more precisely, Whenever one successfully holds on to a fact in the middle of emotional pressure, then confidence in that fact will grow, making it possible to hold on to that fact in the presence of greater emotional pressure. In simple language, belief grows under testing. Using the example of math anxiety, the more that a student learns to solve math problems successfully, the less that student will be susceptible to math anxiety. When one is attempting to build confidence, then it is very important not to try hard, because trying increases the emotional pressure, which actually makes it more difficult to hold on to the facts. Using the analogy of weightlifting, trying increases the weight, making it harder to lift the weight. Going the other way, science generally tries to protect its ability to determine facts by remaining objective. However, this is also counterproductive because one is never faced with a challenge of asserting the facts in the midst of emotional pressure. Using the weightlifting analogy, remaining objective is like avoiding personal injury by trying not to lift anything heavy. When one acquires confidence in facts, then one realizes that facts are independent of feelings. For instance, if a cake tastes good, then that is a feeling. In contrast, the connection between eating too much and gaining weight is a fact. These two are not related. A cake that tastes terrible has just as many calories as a cake that tastes delicious. Logically speaking, this is obviously true. However, we are not talking here about logic, but rather about the ability to assert facts, including facts of logic, in the midst of strong emotions. Feelings may vary widely, but behind these feelings will be a simple, solid confidence in the facts. The natural laws of physics are independent of feelings. The law of gravity, for instance, does not depend upon the social status of the person falling off the cliff. Similarly, I suggest that the mind is also governed by universal laws that are independent of personal opinion. However, even though natural law is independent of personal feeling, it takes mental confidence to recognize that this is the case. A similar principle applies when people agree to be governed by the rule of law. Putting together a set of rules is not sufficient. Instead, people within the society must acquire the mental ability to apply laws impartially without being internally overwhelmed by mental networks of personal gain or emotional status. The stability of the rule of law in a society grows whenever laws apply to important people, and it decreases whenever important people are regarded as above the law. The previous slide talked about childish trust, teenage confusion, and adult knowledge. This progression relates to Piaget's stages of cognitive development, summarized here. The traits of the pre-operational child describe a mind that is governed by mercy mental networks that represent people and experiences. One sees this in the make-believe and pretense of childish play. When a child pretends to be Superman, for instance, then the mental network that represents this imaginary person is imposing its structure upon the behavior of the child. Similarly, the preschool child practices magical thinking, believing that objects act like people and that people have the ability to control natural circumstances, which also tells us that mental networks that represent people are imposing their structure upon the mind. The concrete operational child learns that facts can limit and control the behavior of mental networks. And the concrete operational child is able to use logic if it is stated in concrete terms and illustrated using physical examples. This is a transitional form of thinking that uses facts to stretch beyond mercy mental networks while still thinking in terms of mercy mental networks. The formal operational adolescent, in contrast, is mentally capable of being guided by TMNs of general understanding. Instead of using facts to go beyond concrete experiences, the adolescent can start from a general understanding. Instead of requiring concrete examples in order to use logic, the older student can use abstract logic that does not need concrete examples. And instead of requiring examples from the physical world in order to think, the adolescent is capable of using hypothetical thought to imagine situations that do not exist in real life. These same three stages can be seen in the progression of people's concepts of God throughout history. Tribal religions reflect the thinking of the pre-operational child. The pre-operational child is guided by MMNs that represent powerful people to pretend to be heroes, like Superman. Similarly, tribal religions are guided by MMNs that represent powerful people to worship heroes that are supermen, as illustrated by the Greek gods. The pre-operational child practices magical thinking. Similarly, tribal religion is convinced that natural events are determined by the gods and that one can achieve desired results by appealing to the appropriate god. Fundamentalism reflects the thinking of the concrete operational child. In the same way that the pre-operational child can use facts to go beyond MMNs, so fundamentalism uses the facts of a holy book to go beyond the MMNs of tribal religion. However, just as the thinking of the concrete operational child is still based in MMNs, so fundamentalism is rooted in absolute truth that is ultimately based in MMNs of personal authority. The concrete operational child can use facts to limit and control the behavior of MMNs. Similarly, fundamentalism uses the facts of absolute truth to limit and control personal behavior. And just as concrete operational thought is a transitional form of thinking, so fundamentalism is a transitional form of thought that goes beyond MMNs while still being based in MMNs. We saw in the first presentation that a general understanding that applies to personal identity leads naturally to the concept of a universal God. The formal operational adolescent is able to start from a general understanding. Similarly, the concept of a universal God begins with the TMN of a general understanding and is not based in the words of a holy book. Formal operational thought is able to follow abstract thinking without requiring concrete examples and physical structure. Similarly, when the concept of a universal God is based in abstract understanding, then one does not need the concrete examples of personal testimony or the physical structure of temples and religious rituals. This does not mean that books are rejected or that one retreats to an internal world of theory. Instead, books become viewed as textbooks that are accurate descriptions of truth, and examples are seen as illustrations of general principles rather than as the foundation for faith. When one views science and religion from these three stages, one notices that science currently functions at the third stage of universal understanding, while Christianity is still struggling to make the transition from the second stage of fundamentalism to the third stage of a universal understanding. The cartoon illustrates this struggle because the science textbook has the subscript King James Version, indicating the inherent conflict between a holy book and a textbook. I suggest that books play a major role in helping the mind to make a transition from absolute truth to universal truth, and that this transition can be seen in the tension between a holy book and a textbook. Education starts with rote learning that teaches children facts, such as the times table shown here. These facts are taught as absolute truth based in the MMNs of experts such as school teachers. Facts provide the raw material for thinking. Without facts, there is nothing to think about, and confidence in facts grows as knowledge of facts is tested under pressure. Critical thinking then checks facts by looking for repeated connections. In other words, critical thinking takes what was originally learned as absolute truth and reevaluates it to see if it is universal truth. Absolute truth comes first because it is an instant way of knowing facts in the absence of general knowledge. Universal truth comes later because it takes time to find repetition, and one always evaluates facts in the light of other facts. As the poster suggests, checking the facts makes it possible to remain calm in the midst of emotional pressure. In order to make a mental transition from absolute truth to universal truth, certain requirements must be met. First, the experts must allow thinking. If religious experts use emotional pressure or force to impose belief and discourage thinking, then it will be difficult for a student to progress beyond absolute truth. By the same token, if the student of absolute truth remains emotionally dependent upon experts, then belief will remain at the level of absolute truth. Thus, I suggest that moving from absolute truth to universal truth involves some sort of wilderness experience in which one leaves the experts and spends time alone thinking and checking facts. Notice the difference between this type of wilderness experience and the monk who lives in the wilderness. Both are spending time alone in order to avoid triggering the MMNs of culture and personal authority. However, the goal of the monk is to leave the content of human existence, while the goal of the thinking student is to reevaluate this content. The monk is pursuing the negative goal of suppressing MMNs, while the thinking student is pursuing the positive goal of gaining the TMN of a general understanding. Books make the transition from absolute truth to universal truth easier. That is because a book makes it possible to separate the facts of some source of truth from the emotional status of that source of truth. For instance, the picture shows the 12 disciples of Jesus crowned with halos, indicating the great emotional status that they are given. Some of these men are shown holding the books of the Bible that they have written. Studying these books in the presence of these exalted founders of faith would lead naturally to a strong form of absolute truth. However, it is possible to take the books that these authors have written and study these words on one's own without having the esteemed authors peer over one's shoulder. In addition, the words of a book do not change, encouraging the mind to think in terms of facts that do not change. And the words of the book are arranged in a structured manner, which encourages the mind to approach solid facts from the perspective of structure and understanding. Obviously, a book can only encourage the mind to make a transition from absolute to universal truth if the content of this book describes universal truth. Absolute truth was compared earlier to evaluating a letter by the name written on the envelope. Universal truth, in contrast, opens up the envelope and evaluates what is written inside. The material that is written inside will only pass such an evaluation if it makes sense and corresponds to some type of reality. My research suggests that the Bible makes sense because it describes universal truth about how the mind works. I have suggested that a general theory that applies to personal identity leads to a concept of God, and that a concept of God acquires emotional power when it turns into a TMN. This means that attempting to reevaluate absolute truth about personal identity will probably threaten the integrity of an existing mental concept of God. All mental networks respond with emotional pain when they receive inconsistent input. A mental network that continues to receive inconsistent input will generate ever-increasing emotions of discomfort, as illustrated by the screaming child. When the TMN of a universal theory experiences inconsistent input, then this will generate feelings of pain that are far more universal than the feelings of discomfort generated by some specific MMN. Going one step further, when the TMN of a universal theory that applies to personal identity experiences inconsistent input, then this will generate feelings of universal discomfort that apply to me. Saying this more bluntly, questioning one's concept of God will lead naturally to the fear of impending eternal damnation by God. Suggesting that hell is in one's mind may sound like an innocuous concept, but I suggest that this is not the case because one cannot run away from one's mind. When core mental networks become troubled, then this will have a profound impact upon personal and societal behavior. And if people continue to exist after death as disembodied minds, then these disembodied minds will be irresistibly drawn to environments that are consistent with core mental networks. Thomas Kuhn said that a scientist cannot exist without a paradigm, and that a scientist can only let go of an existing paradigm if he is given an alternative theory that is superior. Similarly, I suggest that the only way to effectively question a mental concept of God is by replacing it with a more universal concept of God. A fundamentalist concept of God that is based in the words of a holy book is always inadequate because one is jumping from the specific words of a book to the TMN of a general understanding. The content of the holy book may describe universal truth and talk about a universal God, but this content is being imposed upon the mind by MMNs of personal status. This juxtaposition of specific source and general content is an inherent part of Piaget's concrete operational stage. One way to resolve this conflict is to change the content to match the source, leading to the concept of a God with a small g, represented by some finite and hopefully friendly person, as illustrated by the typical Hollywood movie. The other option is to change the source to match the content, replacing the MMN of absolute truth with a TMN of a general understanding. This leads to the concept of a universal God with a capital G, as implicitly described by the universal laws of science and illustrated by the global structure of technology. What one can no longer do today is remain within the inherent contradiction of a fundamentalist concept of God. On the one hand, such a concept of God is experiencing strong pressures of skepticism, both from science and from postmodern society in general. On the other hand, the vigor with which fundamentalist belief is defending itself is driving both minds and societies back to the barbarism of tribal gods and tribal warfare. In short, I suggest that one can no longer remain within fundamentalism, but must either go forward to universal truth or backward to blind faith. This is the third presentation in a series. Thank you for watching. I hope to continue this series in the near future.